If you've ever experienced winning multiple buy-ins in a single hand during a tournament, you'll know the draw of the Progressive Knockout or PKO tournament format. But how do we get the most value from PKO games, and how should our strategy change compared to our non-PKO games? Today, we're going to be looking at how to get maximum value from my favorite tournament format, the Progressive Knockout. The first tip is based on player tendencies to place too much emphasis on the value of winning bounties. This leads to opening and calling ranges much wider than GTO Wizard recommends, and can lead to bleeding chips by calling covered players light. This effect becomes even more common in the late stages of a tournament when bounties can represent several buy-ins and stacks are relatively shallow. While we'll see that risk premiums are lower in a PKO game versus non-PKO, we have to avoid over-adjusting, particularly when deciding how much to risk when calling covered players. Let's look at an example in GTO Wizard that illustrates this point. Let's take a look at overall ranges in similar PKO versus non-PKO ICM scenarios. Note, GTO Wizard is working towards implementing comparable PKO and non-PKO or classic solutions, but for now, we'll use two best fit options. First, let's look at Hijack's opening range in the final three tables in a PKO solution. In this example, Hijack is covered by all remaining players at the final three tables of a tournament. And we can see that they're opening just about 22% of hands. And if we take a look at what happens when Under the Gun opens as a covering player, playing about 7% of hands with a mix of going all in or 3-betting non-all in. And we'll take a quick look at the risk premiums associated with playing in this environment. You can see that Hijack, playing against all of these covering players, has about a 4% risk premium across the board. Now let's look at our non-PKO environment. Immediately, you can see that Hijack is covered by all players left to act, as in the previous example, and they're playing just 2.3% more hands than they were in the PKO game. And if we look at their response to Under the Gun, you can see just about 7% of hands are being played, as we saw before. Now, with no all-in, everything is a non-all-in 3-bet. And we can see that the Hijack has a higher risk premium associated with playing, 6.7 to 6.8% against all these covering players. So what about when we cover players? Let's go back and look at our PKO example. Now is Under the Gun. You can see with the entire table covered, with the exception of the big blind, who has one more blind than us, we're playing 20% of hands. And we can also look at our response. If we do face a non-all-in 3-bet, we're 4-betting 25% of our range, calling another 39%, and folding about a third of the time. And we'll just compare that again to our non-PKO. But you can see there's less than a % difference in how Under the Gun plays. Again, having the entire table covered. And now if we look at our response to Hijack's 3-bet, you can see it's quite similar, folding slightly more often, about 10% more hands. And again, we'd see that if we looked at the Under the Gun risk premiums, the risk premiums are slightly higher playing in this non-PKO as well. So the takeaway here is that just because Under the Gun has the players covered in the PKO example that we saw, they're not opening significantly more hands, nor are they calling or 4-betting significantly more hands in the PKO environment. They're actually quite comparable. Now that we've seen a specific example of how these ranges compare, let's look at a big picture that just illustrates how similar PKO and non-PKO ranges are overall. This chart shows how calling ranges compare in a PKO versus classic or non-PKO game near the bubble when stacks are symmetric, meaning equal for all players. You can see that the first row is for all 30 big blind stacks, and the second is for 20 big blind stacks. The columns show how each position reacts to an under-the-gun open, whether it be calling or raising, and the net, that is the combination of how often they're playing hands overall. So for instance, you can see under-the-gun +1 when facing an under-the-gun open is calling 2.8% less of the time in a PKO, but they're raising 2.3% more of the time, which means that overall they're only playing 0.5% less of hands. You can see that across the board, there's less than 1% difference for most positions, apart from the big blind. Let's look at that data in a different way. This bar chart shows how under-the-gun +1, as well as the other positions, are responding to the under-the-gun open, 30 big blinds deep, near the bubble. You can see on the left of each bar chart, the classic response, and on the right is the PKO response. And you can see across the board that folding ranges are almost identical. So for instance, under-the-gun +1 is folding 92% of hands in both cases, low jack 91%, so on and so forth. And here we see the 20 big blind example. Again, fold rates are about the same across the board. So what have we learned from our example as well as from these charts? Well, we've seen that near the bubble of a tournament, our pre-flop play should be very similar in both a PKO and non-PKO game, despite the average player's bounty being higher than at the start. Our second tip relates to the first one, but now we'll look at when we can open up our ranges in a PKO. We typically see the biggest changes in ranges as stack sizes separate. When we find ourselves taking a chip lead over the other players at our table, we find that our opening and calling ranges start to expand a lot. We become surprisingly wide when covering the players left to act, particularly in late position deep in a PKO. In contrast, when we find ourselves as the short stack, we become relatively conservative in a PKO, particularly in the late stages of a tournament. Let's look at a couple examples in GTO Wizard of both of these principles in practice. Let's begin by looking at an example of under-the-gun +1's opening range in a PKO when covered by all other players. You can see that under-the-gun +1 is now playing 17% of total hands. And in contrast, let's look at under-the-gun +1's opening range, but as chip leader at the table. You can see that our range has expanded to 25.7%. That's about an 8.7% increase over how many hands we were able to play when we were covered by all players left to act. Here's another example of a button's opening range when covered by all players left to act, that is the small and big blind. You can see we're playing 30% of all hands, 30.4%. And again, just to contrast, here's an example of button's range covering the small and big blind. We've almost doubled the number of hands we can play, from 30 to 60%. Now let's look at how a covering player responds when a covered player opens. Now we'll begin by looking at how small blind responds to a cutoff open when they're covered by both the big blind and the cutoff. You can see that they're folding 86% of their range while only playing about 14%. And again, we'll just contrast that with our example of small blind, but now as the covering player. You can see just how much more range has opened up versus the previous example. We're raising almost 16%, calling 15%, all in 6%, and only folding 63%. It's a pretty large difference. We're playing 23% more of our hands compared to previously. Now that we've had a look at an example of how wide we can play as a chip lead, it's important to note that this isn't always the case. In-game, it's important to balance the risk premium associated with a spot versus the added incentive of winning one or more bounties. There's actually a formula we can use to convert the value of each bounty into tournament chips to determine how this affects the pot size using the concept of bounty power. Bounty power refers to the value of a bounty in tournament chips, and it's an important concept to know when playing this tournament format. You can check out the article in this video's description for details on calculating and applying bounty power in PKO tournaments. For now, let's look at a general overview of what bounty power means as a PKO tournament progresses. This table shows the overall value of a bounty in chips at various stages of a PKO tournament. You can immediately see that as the number of players remaining decreases, so does the value of each bounty. This is because as the ICM value of our chips increases, the risk associated with losing those chips begins outweighing the value of a bounty, even as the size of each individual bounty increases. Let's look at a couple specific ICM examples to see just how this concept plays out in-game. In this example, we have under the gun going all in for 5 big blinds. Then we have the cutoff reshoving for 15 big blinds, with us in the big blind with 34 big blinds. So with both players covered and the opportunity to get 2 bounties, we can see we're still only calling with 5.8% of our range. In fact, even if the 15 big blind cutoff player just calls, that is, flats the 5 big blind all in, you can see that our range doesn't expand that much. Only 2% or so. So even if we're only paying an extra 4 big blinds, it isn't worth gambling with a wide range for potentially almost half our stack when facing 15 big blinds versus our 34 big blinds. As we saw in the last example, even when risking a third of their stack, the cutoff had an overcall range. Quite often in PKO games, you'll see covering stacks reshoving marginal hands versus all-in short stacks to reduce the number of players in a pot. This play can lose us money in the long run, as it isn't required with our premiums, as we have so much equity post-flop. It opens us up to getting trapped or running into a better hand with action left if we isolate too wide. Let's look at an example. Let's revisit that example from our previous tip, but this time focusing on the cutoffs range. We actually see that despite only having 15 big blinds total, the cutoff is calling more often than going all in versus the under the gun's 5 big blind shove. We can see that cutoff can now call with pocket 8s and pocket 7s, as well as ace 10 suited and ace jack off, while calling with their premiums as well to get maximum value. So we can call with the bottom of our range and fold if we need to, but still get maximum value from aces, kings, and queens. Let's look at one more example to illustrate this point, this time looking at deeper stack play. Here's a typical situation where the chip leader opens under the gun +1, gets called by the cutoff and button, who are both covered by under the gun +1, and now get squeezed by the big blind for 18 big blinds, going all in. You can see that as the largest stack at the table, under the gun +1 has a mixed strategy. That is, reshoving some of the time, but then also raising not all in, as well as calling some of the time. Now what does this do for us? If the under the gun +1 player just calls for 18, the cutoff is now playing about 16%, almost 17% of hands, either all in or flatting. By just overcalling, under the gun +1 can get away from the bottom of their range while getting full value from the top of their range. That is, by getting called some of the time, getting reshoved on some of the time by the cutoff. We can also see that when under the gun +1 4 bets not all in, cutoff is forced to either 5-bet shove or fold pretty much their entire range. If you've played in a number of PKO games in the past, you've probably seen spots like this, where the under the gun player shoves their entire range to isolate the short stack that's all in. But as we can see, that's losing value by not playing this mixed strategy where you can get value from calling. My final tip for today is to use a non-all-in opening sizing when you're short stacked. If you have a hand that plays well heads up, but not multi-way, raising all in for almost but not all of your entire stack means that medium stack players will be less likely to re-raise if a player who covers them is left to act. While if a big stack 3-bets to isolate you, or bets after the flop, the remaining players are more likely to get out of the way. Let's look at an example in HRC. In this example, we see an under-the-gun player at the final 3 tables of a tournament with 7 players. You can see the under-the-gun player has 8 big blinds total, while there are several players at the table that cover him. Now, if we look at HRC, we can see that this is that player's range when we give him both a all-in and non-all-in sizing. You can see that it's playing about 14% of hands, and HRC prefers to use the 7 big blind sizing off an 8 big blind stack, so leaving 1 big blind behind. Let's look at why that is. First, this is how the cutoff, who has 13 big blinds, would respond to an 8 big blind shove versus 7 big blind non-all-in. You can see that they're able to call 4% of the time, that's the green spaces, while they re-raise all in 5.2% of the time, which is the purple spaces. Now, for comparison purposes, this is cutoff's response to a 7 big blind open, where under the gun leaves 1 big blind behind. You can see now that the cutoff is required to raise 8% of their hands and only call about 1% of the time. This means that the cutoff player has to risk their entire stack against the bigger stacks left to act, rather than being able to call some of their range that they now have to go all in with. This puts the cutoff and other middling stacks in a rough spot because they have to risk playing all in with covering players left to act. This concept, known as steal fold equity, refers to leveraging the risks associated with other players' stack to get your hand heads up when short. You can read more about this concept and other multi-way PKO strategies in the Multi-Way Strategy in Progressive Knockout Tournaments article in the description below. Let's review what we've learned through our 5 tips. We saw that in PKO games, we play an overall tighter range in PKOs than the current population plays, particularly when risk premiums come into play later in the tournament. When we have a chip lead against our table, we can expand our range a lot. But when we're covered, we need to tighten up. It's important to recognize the value of winning a bounty in relation to risking our chips. When calling all-ins for a bounty, we should consider calling versus reshoving to isolate. And if short-stacked in early position and going all-in, we can reduce the risk of being called by medium stacks by raising non-all-in. Do you have questions? What are some tips you have for adjusting to PKO games that you've recognized? Are there specific PKO challenges or questions you'd like to discuss? Leave a comment below on this YouTube video or connect with us on Discord. Thanks for watching and have a great day.